The United States annexed Hawaii 125 years ago, despite exhaustive, documented efforts opposing the move by Queen Liliuokalani and most Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians. The annexation came during a time of imperialistic expansion around the globe by the U.S. How many know the true story of what happened? Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Yunji De Nies. In 1893, the Hawaiian Kingdom was illegally overthrown after a group of American businessmen led by Sanford Dole staged a coup against Queen Liliuokalani. The revolutionaries were backed by American troops and the Queen yielded her throne under protest to avoid bloodshed. Despite an order by the U.S. President Grover Cleveland to restore the Queen's constitutional rights, Dole and his provisional government refused, with their sights set on annexation. That came 5 years later, in 1898, following continuous opposition from the Queen, her supporters, and the vast majority of the Hawaiian population. Scholars at the time and since questioned how the United States put aside democracy in lieu of imperialist expansion across the globe that included Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, the Mariana Islands, and Puerto Rico. Our panel tonight looks back at the history of Hawaii's annexation and why it should never be forgotten. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email or call in your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and on the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. John Osorio is the Dean of Hawaiinuiākea School of Hawaiian Knowledge at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, earning his PhD from UH in history. He's an author, composer, and a singer, and has been a Hawaiian music recording artist since 1975. Vina Lanzona is an author and associate professor in the Department of History at UH Manoa. Born and raised in the Philippines, she grew up under martial law in the country. Some of her courses include modern Philippine and South Asian history and women and revolution. Cruz is a host and news reporter with Hawaii Public Radio. Prior to that, she spent more than 30 years as a television reporter at KITV. Originally from Guam, she is also the co-founder of Pacific Islanders in Communications, a nonprofit media arts organization. And Tom Coffman is an independent researcher, writer, and producer. After spending years as a newspaper reporter, he moved on to writing books and video productions. His 1998 film, Nation Within, recounts the exhaustive efforts by Queen Liliuokalani and her supporters to resist annexation. Following our program tonight, PBS Hawaii will broadcast Nation Within, so we want to start our discussion with a brief clip from the film. Take a look.
Events that followed the overthrow have been passed off as inevitable and therefore of little interest. But unearthing the strange 5 years between the overthrow and America's annexation of Hawaii reveals not only where deeds were buried in island soil, but something of how, in the process, America became the world power that it is today.
Thank you all for being here. It is an incredible film, and I encourage folks tonight to make sure to tune in and stay with our program afterwards to watch it. Tom, I want to start with you. Tell us about why you wanted to tell this story.
Well, I came here in 1965, and you know, not knowing much and not knowing more than any other immigrant, really. And I was fortunate to be here at a time when people like John Dominus Holt started to resurrect the story of the Queen and the story of the overthrow, and to question the missionary narrative. And I became caught up in it. I went from being a newspaper reporter to a year working for the Community Action Program in Hawaiian and Kalihi Palama. And there I got to know many, many Hawaiians who were downtrodden, who were, negatively affected by the whole weight of history. And on the one hand, I sensed there was this injustice, and on the other hand, I sensed this pent-up vitality, this tremendous pent-up vitality and potential for pursuing social change, social justice. And I followed that. I followed the evolution of that, and was over a course of a lot of years and a lot of acquaintances and a lot of outings with people traveling the islands and digging into the archives. And I saw that in 1893 there was this tremendous, fantastic upwelling, which brought 20 or 30,000 people together at the palace. Oni pa'a, stand fast. And I was sensing there was no equivalent narrative developing for this, what's called strange 5 years, and they were very strange 5 years. They were years in which history had been tremendous, either completely suppressed or distorted. And so I was determined to work on that, and I did, and I sort of got carried away. And I got connected to some a lot of fantastic resource people, one of whom is John Osorio. In terms of our, narrative, understanding of narrative, at the time, by intuition and some good judgment on my part, I found the two young makers of the next stage of narrative, and they were John Osorio and Dr. Noenoe Silva, both of whom subsequently wrote major works which have become part of the canon of our understanding. And it came together in both a film and a book.
Well, let's talk to John now.
Yeah, I would like to, I just want to preface everything, and without belaboring the point, we no longer use the word annexation to describe Hawaii's status after 1898. And the reason we don't is in part because of the research of people like Noenoe Silva and Dr. Keanu Sai, who really point out that the Hawaiian political reaction of the Hawaiian political parties in the kingdom, in that period of time when we were no longer operating as a kingdom, the Hui Kalai'aina, Hui Ala'aina, successfully set about these two major petitions in the islands, and really put together something like 37,000 signatures on these two petitions, when there were maybe, 38,000 Kanaka Maoli living here, opposing annexation. And the Senate had the opportunity to pass a treaty of annexation in 1897 and failed to secure enough votes. So what we actually have is in 1898 a resolution accepting the cession of Hawaii's authority and control of and the crown and the government lands that had been seized by the illegal government in 1893. So it's a simple resolution. It's passed in both houses, right? We don't really know to this day what actual force of law a resolution has in American jurisprudence, but we do understand that it's not a treaty of annexation. So I use the word territorialization. Hawaii was territorialized in 1898 by that resolution. We were not annexed, and it's important that we say this because it pays homage to the Queen and to her supporters and to the Hawaiian people who opposed it.
I'm interested, you know, when you were growing up, what do you remember being taught about this period in history and how different it is from what perhaps is being taught now or what is not being taught now?
Well, we were taught very little, first of all, and if anything, growing up in a public school system and even at Kamehameha, there was just this sort of notion that we had kind of naturally evolved into American citizens. The story of the Queen and the overthrow of the government really wasn't told, almost as though it was a shameful kind of thing. There was just this immense silence about it. But Tom is absolutely right. In the mid to late 60s, there were just more and more people saying, no, that's not actually the story. The story of Hawaii's takeover is similar to the same kinds of misadventures that the United States was involved in the 1960s, in Vietnam, and previously to that in Korea, that the United States had participated in the destabilizing of the Hawaiian government and had really reaped the benefits of it. That while there had not been an actual armed conflict between American troops and Hawaiian patriots, there was still, there was this intimidation and the actions of the Queen that it basically had prevented bloodshed. That story emerges in the 1960s, and it really, really drives a lot of the Hawaiian protests, land protests of the 1970s, right up to Kaho'olawe.
Yeah. Catherine, I want to bring you into the conversation. I know that you've lived here for many, many years and reported on issues pertaining to Hawaii, but you originally are from Guam, as we noted off the top. Tell us a bit about your experience in learning the history of where you grew up and how it differs, perhaps, of your understanding of it now.
Well, I guess my memory goes back really to, just being under the U.S., right? Because prior to that, we had been taken over by the Japanese. I mean, here in Hawaii, everybody knows, December 7th, 1941. And a lot of people don't know that, Japan had also taken over Guam. And for a number of years, we were under, they were very brutal. The Japanese are very brutal to the islanders. We talk about what happened in the Philippines and the Bataan March, and the Death March. And they did something similar in Guam as well. And I just found out recently from a cousin of mine that, my grandmother miscarried because they just marched the islanders around, endlessly. And so it's just interesting. So my consciousness comes, under the U.S. But I heard the stories from my parents and my grandparents about how brutal it was under the Japanese regime when they took us over. And prior to that, we were under the Spanish, for 200-300 years. And so a lot of our culture and our traditions, come from that place because we were a colony of Spain, and they took over and wiped out a lot of the people and, brought in new religions. And so it's different. But, as a journalist here, living here for, almost 40 years, I remember Onipa'a and covering that and just be an observer, from another island place, but kind of feeling the pain and, trying to understand the history. But yeah, that was a very powerful day. I'll never forget that. It was incredible, just incredible at that palace.
Vina, we mentioned off the top, of course, that you grew up in the Philippines, but you bring a lens here of being an associate professor in history. Why do you think it's so important for people, especially indigenous people, to understand their history and the truth of where they come from?
Well, I think I'll just like to follow up with what Catherine was talking about in terms of how people perceive American influence or American relationship with the Philippines. I mean, it's the same, like for a long time. And until now, I think Filipinos always thought about Americans as liberators, against the Japanese, right? So and also following what John was talking about in terms of annexation, I think for Filipinos, it is both annexation and, of course, colonization, right? And the Filipinos I think it's really important for us now to still remember what happened in 1898. And I think that's really my role as a professor and also as a historian, is to somehow unearth the truth about 1898 and about U.S.-Philippine relations, because I always tell my students that we should always remember that the relationship with the U.S. started as a really violent relationship, because not only was, we were also annexed forcibly in 1898, we already had the revolution before that, and we already have a government. And in fact, we're ready to ratify a constitution, our independent republic. But then, because of the Spanish-American War, we were acquired by the U.S., right? And of course, the Filipinos resisted. The Filipinos resisted. We have the Philippine-American War. So I could never really talk about annexation without talking about the Philippine-American War, because really they're connected, because the Filipinos did not just accept the U.S. making it part of the empire, but in fact fought, and almost 1 million people died, because of that fighting. And the revolutionaries, a lot of them also died during the war. So that's, and I feel that that's really important. And in fact, when I tell that to my students, people are still very surprised that the relationship with the Philippines started that way. And here in Hawaii, most of my students, of course, grew up here and studied in the public schools here or in schools here in Hawaii. And they haven't heard of the Philippine-American War. They haven't really thought about the Philippines having this very, violent beginning, or with their relationship with the U.S. And I think it's really important for us to continue to talk about it, because it's still very real, in terms of how we look at our relationship with our past and our relationship now with the U.S.
Tom, I'm interested, when you were making this film, one of the things that struck me was that, how is this not better known? When we'd have the kind of participation that John's talking about, with thousands of people signing this and petitioning against this. And I had the opportunity to speak with the director of the film about this. And one of the things that she pointed out was, well, the primary sources, which are the Hawaiian, about what role you think that plays. And now we have this renaissance of many, many more people being able to speak Hawaiian and getting to access those sources.
Right. One of the key things was my relationship with Noenoe Silva. And Noenoe Silva was an early day practitioner of exploring the Hawaiian language newspapers. She's an extremely talented linguist, and she dug out what became, I think, a bicultural, binational perspective, right? So in the newspapers, and in the previously hidden in the Hawaiian language, was a national narrative of the Hawaiian nation, and over here is a national narrative of the United States. And so that became, part of the dynamic of, unearthing the two and showing how the United States basically occupied Hawaii, how the words became. I agree with, I'm interested in John's word territorialization. I think that's an interesting word. But in common parlance, the word illegal was attached not only to the overthrow, but then it was attached to the words annexation, or the word became occupation. And I think you can only get there by getting into an understanding through records like the Hawaiian newspapers, that there was a Hawaiian national narrative that drove, it was that history going forward, and I think that, today becomes the basis for understanding, contemporary events. I think it sheds a lot of light on contemporary events.
John, you were describing this sort of, that you were taught that it was an inevitability that Hawaii would become part of the United States. And I remember growing up and thinking and learning that it was also for Hawaii's protection, right? And that's laid out to a great degree in the film, that somehow that there were these outside forces, primarily Japan, that were a threat to Hawaii, and so Hawaii was kind of protected in this way and became territory and then a state. What do you think kids are learning now, and do you think enough of the truth is being taught?
I'd like to address that question, but I want to also say that this is one of the reasons why it's really, really important to understand America's imperial role in the Pacific and in Asia. When we teach in the foundational Hawaiian Studies course, Hawaiian Studies 107, we don't just teach about Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian history. We actually examine our relationship to all of Oceania, really, because we are ancestrally connected.
Yeah.
We come from common ancestors, Austronesian-speaking people that, that occupied really the whole Western Pacific region and did this migration forward. We see ourselves as part of this, larger history. And then we see the comparable histories that we have endured in terms of takeovers by European nations and the United States. We see the rise and fall of national fortunes, right, played out in the Pacific. And it's important to teach these things to people so we don't see this as inevitable. We see this as the result of specific groups of people exerting, power, money, militarization, in key times in the world. I think that students today are much more aware, right, of that history that none of us knew, really, when I was a teenager. None of us knew. Yeah. Our understanding of the United States in the 1960s was as victors in the Second World War. And now I think more and more young people, they take as a matter of course there was this power play. There have been this series of power plays. It has affected our people in really similar ways, and that it is a natural enough thing to know this and to conceive of a future where maybe we shift, from that into something that is much healthier for ourselves and for our islands and for our people.
Yeah. I want to alert people to something that happened that's very, very interesting. The National Portrait Gallery currently has an exhibition on the 1898 United States expansion, not only, of course, Hawaii, but into Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. It's the first major Smithsonian exhibition that focuses on this very controversial time in our nation's history. Catherine Cruz had the opportunity to go to Washington and actually get to see this in person. Tell us a little bit about this exhibition and why it's so significant.
Well, I learned about it because I was covering the exit of the Queen's portrait from the palace, and they were saying it was going to get boxed up and sent across to D.C. to be part of this exhibit. It was on loan, and in exchange for that, the portrait was going to be reinforced, cleaned, and so it was really a major deal for this portrait to leave the islands the first time. So that was how I found out about it. And then it was like, oh, well, what does this have to do with the Spanish-American War? I don't really understand. I mean, because, you learn, part of the history, but I just never really could figure out how it all connected with Hawaii's issues. And the value of that exhibit to me was incredible because it connected the dots. And so then I could understand, oh, okay, that's why the Hawaiians are mad, and that's why, what happened to the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba. And so for me, that was the aha moment. And, Tom and I had this conversation when I looked at the Guam area, it's thin compared to Hawaii and the other places because there's not much left. And I was surprised to see a petition on the wall. I mean, I'd actually, as part of the whole thing, I had gone with and covered the Hawaiians that were there, and they went to the archives, and they saw the actual petitions, and they looked for their relatives' names, and that was pretty emotional. It was very powerful. But then to see the Guam exhibit and see a petition there from a group of leaders in the community asking the U.S., please, why can't we elect our own officials? Why can't we have a tomorrow or a governor who we choose ourselves? And it said, we think over the years we have shown our loyalty to the U.S. and we are grateful for, you liberating us from the Japanese, but we have shown our loyalty and we expect that we should be able to vote for our own leaders. And then I saw my, my relative's name on there, Gregorio Perez, and that was like my, great-grandfather. And so that just kind of blew me away. And I had to call my auntie to say, did you know about this? And the people of Guam didn't just petition one time, they petitioned 8 times.
Yeah, the same for the
we were
Philippines,
under naval governors for so long. And so that was just kind of an aha moment, like I said, kind of understanding what Hawaii was going through, and now understanding what Guam went through, because we looked at the U.S. as liberators. And I remember as a child learning and being asked about the 4th of July, Liberation, Independence Day, and I didn't really quite get that because we celebrate Liberation Day when the U.S. came in and liberated us from the Japanese.
We celebrated July 4th for a long time as our Independence Day. After the war, the U.S. granted Philippines independence on July 4th, 1946. So, but then we changed it now. I mean, it's been changed since the 60s to June 12, which is the day when our republic was proclaimed. But just going back to 1898 and the exhibit, it's really important to. I feel like 1898 really our histories got intertwined in that sense. Like Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam, and of course Puerto Rico, and all the arguments about why they needed, to annex the Philippines. It was the same as what they said about Hawaii, like they also needed to protect it from all the other foreigners or foreign countries that were interested in the Philippines, like Germany. So the U.S. was there to protect it from other aggressive nations, right? And the way that they also portray our leaders, so Queen Liliuokalani, and we have our own president, Emilio Aguinaldo. They were presented in the U.S. press as savages, children, primitives who really needed the tutelage and the guidance of the U.S. because they don't really understand democracy, right? In that sense, like the Hawaii is a monarchy, and then the Philippines was under 300 years of Spain, which was really this kind of feudal, country, nation that was, did not really teach Filipinos how to govern themselves. So all the same arguments, that we faced when you think about Hawaii, what they said, and of course the issue of racism was very, very potent, right? In terms of the way they portrayed the Filipinos, and in fact, even our revolution against Spain was seen, and then our war against Americans for a long time they thought about it. They presented it as an insurgency. It wasn't a legitimate war, when in fact, of course, we had a republic, and the U.S. at that point really dismissed that because Filipinos are not ready.
Yeah, and
I was reminded today. I was reading again about Frederick Jackson Turner and Alfred Mahan, a captain who both in the same sort of period. Turner in 1893 publishes this thesis that because Americans have basically run out of frontiers, that they were everywhere in the North American continent. They really had to, in order to continue American energy and American spirit, they basically had to proceed across the Pacific. It was manifest destiny. It was something that needed to happen for America to realize its greatness. Captain Mahan is saying, it's naval power that accounts for the rise and fall of nations, which, you know, this is targeting places like Hawaii, but also the Philippines.
Yeah.
You know, also Guam. These possessions become necessary for America to move forward. And I keep thinking of this, you know, because at the same time, Cuba is in revolt against the Spanish, and Puerto Rico wants its independence. And there are lots of Americans who think that they should have their independence.
Yeah.
They don't like the Spanish. They think the Spanish are cruel, almost universally. But very few Americans actually speak up for Native people, Tainos, or, you know, the descendants of slaves being able really to govern themselves. And so that's where a lot of that racism is. Like, you can take these places because really they're not like us. And
I was struck during that exhibit to see and to learn about the Filipinos' fight for independence. And, you know, I'm part Filipino, I'm part Spanish, you know, and at the time when I went to DC, I saw it as an opportunity to also do some research on my husband's family because, you know, he has ties to folks that were in George Washington's army, and they were fighting for freedom against the British. So to go one day, you know, to the portrait gallery, another day to go to the archives, and then go to the Cincinnati Society and learn about how the Americans, you know, tried to get their independence from the British. And I just thought, why is independence not good enough for the Filipinos, you know, or the Chamorros? And we suffered under the Spanish as well. They were very brutal. You know, so the Americans were nice to people in Guam, you know, at the time. And so there is a little different perspective. And I know there are folks that are, you know, raising their voices about the militarization of Guam and the buildup of the bases there. And, you know, there are young people who have been educated here at the University of Hawaii, and they see what has happened here in Hawaii. And so they're learning and they're questioning, you know,
I mean,
the military.
they still maintain their presence in the Pacific, you know, and it really happened at the beginning of the you know, 19th century, you know, when they wanted to project what John was saying, their naval power. And they know that, you know, in a way, the Spanish-American War provided them this opportunity because they were raring for war, right? And then they found the war, they defeated the Spanish handily, easily, you know, and then they have now what to do with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And in fact, there was this famous story of McKinley not even knowing exactly where the Philippines was. And he had to look in the map and said, okay, this is the Philippines, and what should we do? You know, if you give them up, it's a cowardly act. So he then invoked his Christianity. You know, God spoke to me that we have to take the Philippines and we need to civilize them and Christianize them. You know, so it's really, I mean, it's the same discourse as, you know, all the other.
You talk about the military might. One of the things in that exhibit points out that a lot of the naval officers kind of cut their teeth on the wars with the Indians. You know? And so, and I'm part Native American too, but you know, so you're just you hurt for all of these indigenous peoples under the greater might, whoever it is that's taken over the country.
I want to bring in some viewer questions, and we have quite a few. I have some for John, but first I want to go to Tom here. Mike on Kauai says, do you think Hawaii would have inevitably been occupied by another country if not annexed by the United States? And another caller saying, I appreciate all the research by the panel. In 1898, there were only 30 to 40,000 Hawaiians remaining. What would have happened if the U.S. didn't territorialize Hawaii? Hawaii was very weak at that point. What do you think of that viewpoint?
The answer to his question is no, I do not think another country would have taken it over, because I think you know, the diplomacy. This is John's history, but the diplomacy of 1843 by the Hawaiian Kingdom had secured commitments from the Great Western Sea Powers, the United States, Britain, and France, guaranteeing the independence of Hawaii.
And Hawaii had a very friendly relationships with Japan.
And Hawaii had a very friendly relationship and historic relationship with Japan that was uniquely enhanced by Kalakaua and then reinforced by the Queen. And because this sort of hangs as the great bugaboo of history, if we hadn't rescued Hawaii, then the Japanese would get. I specifically asked that question of the two leading historians of U.S.-Japanese history, Dr. Akira Irie of Harvard and Dr. So-and-so of Wisconsin. And they both said, no, that Japan had no interest and had no documentable interest in taking over Hawaii.
Interesting that I think the history of American and Japanese relationships might have been very, very different if there's not an American buildup, naval buildup in Hawaii in the 20th century.
I don't like what-if history, but but I cannot avoid the thought, the agonizing thought, that the horror of the Pacific War might never have occurred had it not been for America's takeover of Hawaii and the way in which it threw that relationship into a disequilibrium. And it followed that Franklin Roosevelt was advised by the commander of the Naval District at Pearl Harbor and by a lot of other people to not move the American fleet to Pearl Harbor, to not headquarter the American fleet of Pearl Harbor because it was a provocative act.
I want to bring
and so that's an extension of that history, but it's history that's got a very deep root.
John, I want to bring these questions to you, and I'll read 4 of them, and there's a variety of opinions, so you can just hear the differences in how our viewers are thinking right now. So Alan in Waimea says, can you please discuss the possibility of Hawaii becoming an independent country today? Kenson saying, what are the chances of restoring the Hawaiian monarchy and the Hawaiian kingdom? And Jimmy, having an alternate view, says, Hawaii is part of the United States. Most people in Hawaii like being Americans. We will stay Americans, even if a few loudmouth secessionists don't like it. Lastly, Eric in Kailua saying, is there a Hawaiian sovereignty movement today?
So we'll start with, yes, there's a Hawaiian sovereignty movement today. It's very much a multifaceted movement, with a number of people favoring the restoration of the kingdom as a legal right. As a legal restoration, the only thing that you can do to honor international law is to restore the kingdom more or less as intact as possible. There are others who are pursuing decolonization along the lines of what the United Nations recommends in 1947 following the war, that people who have been colonized have the right to a plebiscite, a vote that includes the possibility of independence. And then there are people who argue strenuously that, America is too powerful and, Hawaiians should just simply have their own government within the state of Hawaii, nation within a nation. Kalahui was one of the first major, sovereignty initiatives in the late 1980s, and it still exists today. And there are still many people who feel that that kind of government would work. As to whether Hawaii could actually be independent again,
yes,
I have
John.
it on.
Answer the question.
One person I almost want to quote is former Governor John Waihee, and he says things that I think are startlingly true, that the state of the American Republic is so fractious at this point and so unpredictable that we don't know what the United States is actually going to look like 10 years from now. Through a couple of really difficult presidential elections, with so many Americans unable to speak to each other across a partisan divide, you know, one of the times when this has happened before, there was a civil war, and who knows what the American Republic might look like. In such a situation, Hawaii might have independence forced on it, and he feels, and I certainly feel, that we should be prepared in Hawaii for much more local, you know, local rule.
We can do a whole show on sovereignty, and I'm sure at some point we will. Catherine,
Yes.
I want to go back to what you were saying about those students from Guam and learning from the Hawaiian experience. I'm interested because Guam is in the unique position of not being a state, of being, you know, a territory. And you spoke on an interview that I listened to on your program on Hawaii Public Radio about how even in your own family, that some of your family members can vote and some cannot. What is the view from that perspective and being part of the U.S.?
Well, it's crazy. I mean, I can vote. I was born in on an Air Force base in California, so I get to vote for president. My vote counts. My oldest brother was born in San Francisco. He gets to vote. I have a brother and a sister that live in Guam, and their vote doesn't count. People of Guam have a non-voting delegate to Congress. We don't have a congressional delegation with 4 votes. You know, we lobby, but we don't have a vote. And so we rely on our friends, you know, in Hawaii and whatever connections that people can make. So yeah, it's difficult. And you know, that said, I mean, I was born in an Air Force base. My father was in the Air Force and the Navy. I have a brother that's a retired Marine colonel, a brother that's a retired Army colonel. You know, so I come from a military background. I lived on a base in Guam. I had base privileges. You know, but our family also had our land taken away by the military, you know, and we've had some of it returned. So, yeah, it's complex, you know. And as a journalist, you know, I've always been an observer. And so here in Hawaii, I've always observed, you know, just the kind of the renaissance with Hawaii culture and the power of, you know, the sovereignty movement. It's complicated, you know, and like I said, you kind of look to the similarities and the differences, and there are more similarities.
Well, and to that end, you know, Janice from Pearl City says the annexation was wrong, but don't you think we have a better structure under the U.S.? And it's kind of that tension that you're talking about. Which Independence Day do you celebrate, and are you the victim or the victor? You know, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it was. This is what, you know, Filipinos always want to argue, that they're all this, you know, good things that we got from the U.S. For example, the system of public education, and it's true, you know, that under the Spanish, of course, it was very limited elite education. The U.S. introduced public education. They did introduce all these democratic institutions, right? You know, because they have this kind of sense of, this is a tutelary colonialism. We are going to teach you how to be democratic, or the practice of democracy, you know. So and then they also reformed the health and sanitation systems, you know. So we have a very similar political institutions in the Philippines, in the U.S. We have the party system, we have a bicameral legislature, we have the 3 branches of government, all that. And these are things that a lot of Filipinos are thankful for in terms of the influence of the U.S. But at the same time, you know, it was, I mean, as we said, there's a lot of, you know, violence in terms of the history with the U.S., and there was a lot of militarization, and the U.S. was very strong in terms of censoring and surveilling people, and, you know, so we have this kind of, you know, as you know, most Filipinos have a kind of love-hate relationship with the U.S. You know, on the one hand, the U.S. did this, but on the other hand, it was really, in the end, it was the U.S. was serving mostly their interests, you know, and the interest is to become a kind of an empire, right? I mean, this whole idea that it was an exceptional empire in that sense, right? You know, when the U.S. started in the Philippines, they want to say we're not the same as the Europeans. We are an exceptional empire because it's a benevolent assimilation, as they said, right? But in fact, in terms of the reality, it was just as violent, you know, just as exclusionary, just as discriminatory. I mean, all these, you know, things that are really transformed, you know, treated Filipinos as colonized citizens.
Yeah, and that exhibit, you know, for me was an eye-opener because I didn't realize how many Filipinos died in their fight for independence.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And to think that, you know, Filipinos make up a large portion of our population today, and they need to know that history to help them understand, you know, the
exactly.
powers at play.
John, can you take this one? It says, are we as of this date occupied by America? And if so, what rules of engagement or protocols should America, aka the state of Hawaii, be implementing right now? International humanitarian law should be enacted, or no? Who or what agency oversees this?
Well, so in what I've read of Dr. Kanesai's work, really it is the responsibility of the military in Hawaii to observe and protect rules of engagement in Hawaii when you've got a situation where there's occupation. But the United States doesn't recognize that this is occupation. And what we have seen actually is that between 1900, that territorialization, and 1959, the Statehood Act, the United States essentially has created a situation where many people basically think of us as another state in the American Union. We don't realize that we were never given a vote per UN guidelines that would allow the choice of independence. This is one of the things that leads some people to say, you can't trust any of the system. We should actually really pay close attention to laws of occupation and rules of engagement under laws of occupation. We're an occupied state. The United States needs to leave, and the kingdom should be restored as close to its original state as possible. That's the kind of rhetoric and the kind of conversations that we have among ourselves. But I really, really want to point out that when people say that, or ask the question, aren't we better off as citizens of the United States? I would say that settlers are better off. But the Kingdom of Hawaii, and Tom can actually absolutely back me up on this, the Kingdom of Hawaii was a highly functional and very liberal constitutional monarchy that offered the franchise very liberally to Asians, to haole, and when you look at the legislatures of the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s, it's this polyglot legislature. It is exactly what the United States and Americans basically said was proper for modern countries. That's the country that the United States took over.
That is such an interesting distinction. I mean, I wonder what you would say to Janice's question about annexation was wrong, but aren't we better off under this structure?
It's the kind of question that makes me crazy.
And why
sorry.
is that?
Because it poses a revisiting of history that says it's a what if and then a false equivalent. But to regroup.
I mean, do you agree with what John is saying, that it is better for the settlers, but not necessarily for the native population?
Yeah, I think that's an important way to think of it. And, I think that recently I did a book on social work, the evolution of social work and the social justice movement in Hawaii. And it was very clear from the processes that Queen Liliuokalani Children's Center remarkably led through the person of Pinky Thompson and other people of addressing, the way in which colonization was not good for Hawaiians, and Hawaiians were being systematically at that point in the history. We need to realize that communities have histories, sub-communities have histories, and they're all doing something, intertwining and then doing something different. Hawaiians converged on Honolulu to a significant extent because of the takeover of the plantation and the collapse of the agricultural system that resulted. And with statehood and rising economy and development, and particularly housing costs and rental costs, Hawaiians were sort of systematically being decentralized out of Honolulu. And I realized, in thinking about my own experience, that was where I stumbled in the door, because I was sort of the field boy to run out to Waianae and Nanakuli. And all these people, they'd all moved out of Honolulu because they all needed, some air to breathe and some low-cost housing, and the sense of community there. Yeah. So I agree with John's observation. I'd like to back up and say colonization is just uniformly not good for people.
At any point in history.
And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so delighted with, seeing ourselves together, seeing the three of you together. We see this denominator, and we see that there's, something that Americans really do need to come to terms with, This isn't just an idle conversation,
Well, we want to encourage you, of course, after this program to watch the film, and it will also live on our website for some time, so if you happen to miss it or want to share it with someone in your family, tonight at 8:30 it airs, and then again it's on pbshawaii.org. Catherine, what do you think the lessons are going forward? We only have about 3 minutes left, so we have to wrap things up. But what do you think the lessons are going forward in a discussion like this, in a movie like that, an exhibit like the one you saw? What do we need to take away?
That you use it to do further research. I mean, when I, was learning about Hawaii, and when Nainoa Thompson, went to Maupi Island to learn about navigation, what connects us, what disconnects us. But that set me on a journey reading the actual accounts of all the explorers that went through the Pacific, the Dutch, the Basque, the Spanish, the British, and it just has opened my eyes, and you just develop a deeper understanding and an appreciation for what went on back there, for the native peoples. Not a good story. So I think just use these exhibits, use the film, use this conversation to do more research, and look at the original sources, so you aren't reading through filters and get a distorted picture.
John, we started this conversation with what you were learning in history, what we hope that students are learning now. What are the lessons that you hope people take from this discussion, the exhibit and the film, going forward?
I just want to reiterate what Tom said. Colonization is bad. Occupation is bad.
Yes.
We're seeing these things play out currently in Palestine, and it's horrific. It's awful. It's awful for everyone. It's awful for populations, for communities. It's awful for Jews. It's awful for Arabs. And there has to be a better way for human beings to be able to coexist, to manage each other's presence, because the planet is now speaking to us.
And in fact, to just talk about colonization, the whole process of decolonization will take generations, right? To decolonize our minds and our attitudes, and until now, we still have what we call colonial mentality. That's why all this myths about American benevolence has been perpetrated, because people continue to be miseducated. people continue to be colonized in their minds. So the whole process of decolonization is something that's really will take generations, you know. So yes, I agree. Colonization is bad, and we need to decolonize. But
Tom, in the 30 seconds that we have left, what do you hope people take away from watching the film that you made?
Well, I hope that they can relate it to this conversation. I hope that people can relate it to something that we're working on inventing out of thin air called the 1898 Project, which is an ongoing, you know, dialogue project. And some of the university people are working on getting behind it, and so on and so on. I can't.
So we'll have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It flies by, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, mahalo to all of you for joining us tonight. We do, of course, thank our guest, John Osorio, Dean of Hawaiinuiākea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, and Catherine Cruz from Hawaii Public Radio, along with UH Associate Professor Vina Lanzona and writer and producer Tom Coffman, whose film Nation Within that we've been discussing airs right after this. No insights next week, thanks to Thanksgiving, but we'll be back the week after. The holidays are usually a great time for giving, with many nonprofits in our community asking for support. But over the last few years, there has been a significant drop in donations due to the hurdles of the pandemic and inflation. With the need so great following the tragedy in Lahaina, we'll hear from local organizations about the challenge of giving. Please do join us then. I'm Yunji De Nies for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Aloha.